Okay. My author, Roger Scruton, a British philosopher. He's a political philosopher and an aesthetics philosopher. He's quite conservative. I didn't recognize that coming into this. Not quite as conservative as the previous author, but he does a lot of work on, I don't want to call it work, he gives a lot of lectures. He has a program called the Scruton, where he just discusses things. And this book, The Soul of the World, is actually a collection of his lectures, not specifically Scruton, but lectures given at various times. And it's not chronologically in order. It's a collection of thoughts, and it's an argument. It's kind of set up with the first and final chapters being an introduction and a conclusion to his argument against evolutionary psychologists. And that is a weird term. Basically, they explain the human mind and our intellect in pragmatic terms, and he argues that we can't do this because our minds aren't something that we can actually recognize in the physical world. So the whole book, he talks about the existence of a transcendental realm. That's his primary argument against the evolutionary psychologist. He explains that there's a transcendental realm that connects our physical bodies with our intellects, and it's not something that can be explained by science. And there's no physical expression of our thoughts, which I'll get to later. So his first argument, as we get into the book, is the internal states of our minds. He spends a lot of time arguing that these evolutionary psychologists don't pay attention to our inner mind. They pay attention to our external mind, which is our rational thought process, what a rational response to a stimuli might be. But he explains that humans have irrational tendencies, and we have the ability to make choices of whatever we want, and so we can't explain our minds in pragmatic terms that expect us to respond rationally at every single point in time. He explains that cognitive dualism is one of his primary arguments as well. Basically, that humans aren't just physical beings, but when we address each other, that we address each other not only physically, but also through a transcendental realm, through the way we process things. We have an inner mind, and this is tough to explain without context. This is not the quote that I'm thinking of. He explains there's a correlation between the I and the you, and the I is our inner existence, and the you is our physical existence. It's kind of tough to explain that only physically. Animals exist as we see them in a physical sense. They don't see each other. From what we know, animals don't communicate on a spiritual level. They don't communicate in ways other than physical. He gives an example of actually an ant and a human initiating a sacrifice. He gives an example of an ant marching into a fire outside of an anthill, and a police officer placing himself over a grenade to save his platoon. And the evolutionary psychologists argue that these two instances are equal in terms of sacrifice, but he says that their argument of moral altruism, that animals do act on behalf of other animals, is just not consistent because they don't have the same thought processes as humans, and they don't have the same irrational intellect. The police officer made a decision to give his life for his platoon, but the ant had no actual forenotion that the fire might kill it, or that it was saving its I guess we'll put it that way. And there's a scientist, McMahon, that actually explains that animals they don't perceive their future, they don't think about and like take care of themselves in preparation for their future selves, that they act in the moment. And while humans do act in the moment, we have a concept of where are we gonna be after we put ourselves on this grenade, like will we still be alive? The ants don't think that way. He also talks about how we can see our souls through smiling, which is it's a common explanation, I think. He says that when we smile, it shows our inner soul, and it's the closest that we can get to actually seeing a transcendental realm. And then he talks about a musical space, and I think that he's trying to relate music to a physical representation of something that is transcendental in nature. Music itself, he explains that it might sound far-fetched, but he says when you look at music like this, just sheet music, you see the notes and you see the movement from note to note, but we can't physically represent the sound that makes. But when you play that on a piano, it does, or a violin, it does make music, and that's something that he relates to our minds and how we can't physically express our mental, our inner minds in the same way that we can't express actual sound in music. And he goes on to talk about how silence is a form of expression, just like music, like actual melodies are a form of expression. So he moves all around just to try and certify that there is a transcendental realm. And he ties it together by just, this is hard to explain with the music. I think I'll leave it there. This doesn't do the book justice. It's really a long tangent and a long argument. I don't think I did the book justice, but yeah, he really wants to explain that we can't quantify our human minds as something scientific, that evolution doesn't explain why we are the way we are, and that there's really no way to quantify our inner minds and why we act irrationally. And that's his book.